The small town of Oak Haven seemed frozen in time. The police station was housed in a two-story brick building dating back to the middle of the last century. Solid wooden doors, creaky floorboards, and a leaky water cooler gave the place a charm that even the modern computers on the desks couldn't spoil. Captain Forrest Avery liked to get to work early. In those morning hours, he could review reports, drink coffee, and prepare for the new day. Tall, trim, with a faint gray on his temples, he exuded the quiet confidence of a man with his feet on the ground. 20 years of service had taught him to appreciate those moments of quiet before the workday began. The last 3 months had been hectic, with a wave of burglaries sweeping the city. The criminals acted boldly and professionally, leaving no trace. Forrest felt the growing pressure from the mayor's office and the locals for results. That's why he was glad when Detective Ruth Callinger was transferred to their department. She had an excellent reputation. 3 years ago, she had solved a similar series of burglaries in a neighboring county. Ruth stood out among her colleagues, slim, with short, dark hair cut short and an attentive look in her brown eyes. She preferred strict suits and hardly used makeup, concentrating on her work. That morning, Ruth appeared at the station right after the captain, holding a cardboard cup of coffee from the local coffee shop, Martha's, and a weighty file folder. She nodded briefly to Forrest and headed for her desk, where crime scene photos and a map of the city with marked theft points were already spread out. Steve Boyd, who occupied the desk across the hall, often joked about her pedantry, but even he recognized the effectiveness of Ruth's methods. She could spend hours analyzing data, looking for the smallest details and patterns. Forrest appreciated this approach. It reminded him of his own working methods as a young man, before administrative duties had taken up most of his time. By noon, the station was filled with the usual bustle. Phones rang, doors slammed, officers scurried back and forth with papers and cups of coffee. Forrest watched Ruth methodically lay out new photographs on the board, connecting them with red threads. Her theory was that criminals didn't choose houses at random. All the families robbed were connected in one way or another to the local country club. In the evening, when most of the staff had gone home, Forrest stayed late to discuss the details of the investigation with Ruth. She showed him her notes, the neatly handwritten pages modeled with underlines and notes in the margins. Forrest returned home late. Gina, his wife, was already asleep, having left a container of dinner in the refrigerator for him. He mechanically heated the food in the microwave, thinking of new leads in the case. For some reason, he could see Ruth's concentrated face as she explained her theory, and the way she absent-mindedly tucked a loose strand of hair behind her ear. He pushed those thoughts away almost at once, though. He had a wonderful family, a loving wife, and 2 wonderful teenage children, now visiting their grandmother for the summer vacation. And Ruth Callinger was just the kind of savvy detective who could help him solve this case. Nothing more. The investigation into the series of robberies was dragging on. 2 months had passed, and there had been no significant breakthroughs, despite Ruth's theory about the victim's connection to the country club. Forrest was staying late at the station more and more often, reviewing the case files with Ruth. These evening discussions gradually became a kind of ritual for them. One day, when the clock was almost midnight, Ruth brought 2 cups of coffee from the vending machine in the hallway. Forrest lifted his head from his papers and smiled gratefully. In the dim light of the desk lamp, her face seemed especially spiritual, and the golden sparkle in her eyes. He caught himself admiring her and looked away hastily. Another cold dinner was waiting for him at home. Gina had stopped waiting for him to return, leaving short notes on the refrigerator. "Warm it up in the microwave. Kisses." Forrest felt a prick of guilt, but the job demanded full commitment. At least that's what he'd convinced himself. Ruth noticed their relationship changing too. Casual touches while they worked on papers, glances that lingered longer than necessary, an unspoken understanding of each other. She tried to ignore the mounting tension, reminding herself of professional ethics and the fact that Forrest was married. The turning point came during a stakeout of a suspect. They were sitting in an inconspicuous squad car parked in the shade of the trees. It was a sweltering August evening. Ruth undid the top button of her blouse, and Forrest involuntarily followed the movement. Their eyes met, and something changed irrevocably. The first kiss had happened in the precinct archives, where they had gone down for old files. Between dusty shelves filled with cardboard boxes, Forrest suddenly pulled Ruth to him. She did not resist. Then they were silent for a long time, not looking at each other, pretending that nothing had happened. But that was the beginning. They met furtively at a motel on the outskirts of town, in her small apartment when Gina went to visit her parents. Each meeting began with a discussion of the case, but ended very differently. Forrest knew he was betraying his wife, but he couldn't resist the attraction to Ruth. Ruth rented an apartment in an old house on a quiet street. Small but cozy, it reflected the character of her landlady, a minimum of things, many books, everything in its place. On the rare evenings when they could be together, Forrest liked to watch her making coffee in the tiny kitchen, fixing her hair, frowning as she read papers. At work, they kept an impeccably professional demeanor. No one could suspect anything personal in their relationship. Ruth had learned to control her gestures and glances, and Forrest was even more reserved than usual. Only Steve Boyd gave them the occasional odd look, but he remained silent. Gina began to notice a change in her husband. He skipped family dinners more and more often, almost stopped talking about work, became absent-minded. One day she found a receipt from a coffee shop across town in his shirt pocket, but she didn't say anything. Perhaps she didn't want to know the truth. Their secret meetings became a necessity, like air. Forrest realized that this madness couldn't last forever, but he couldn't bring himself to stop. Ruth, too, realized that they were walking on very thin ice. She tried not to think about the future, living only in the present moment. Autumn in Oak Haven was a beautiful fall. The trees had turned gold and purple, and in the mornings the grass sparkled with hoarfrost. Forrest and Ruth sometimes went out of town, ostensibly to check out new leads in a robbery case. They parked their car on deserted forest roads and took long walks amid the fall splendor, allowing themselves to forget for a while the need to pretend. At the station, everything went on as usual. The investigation was progressing slowly but surely. They had drawn up detailed psychological profiles of the alleged perpetrators and set up surveillance on several suspects. No one realized that behind the professional facade of the police captain and his subordinate lay such a dangerous secret. Ruth would often wake up in the middle of the night and stare at the ceiling for long periods of time, thinking about what her life had become. She had always prided herself on her integrity, but now she was involved in a deception that could ruin not only her career but someone else's family as well. Sometimes she tried to bring it up with Forrest, but he found ways to avoid serious conversation. More and more, Forrest found himself thinking that his feelings for Ruth were becoming deeper than mere attraction. He noticed every little detail: the way she wrinkled her nose when she was concentrating, the way her lips tightened when she was displeased, the way her voice changed when she talked about something important to her. It frightened him the most. It had been an unusually snowy winter in Oak Haven. The white flakes swirled slowly outside the police station window, giving the illusion of serenity. Ruth sat at her desk, tapping the edge of the burglary file with a pencil. It was hard on her mind. She hadn't slept much in the last 2 weeks. Thoughts about the impropriety of what was happening kept her awake. Every time she saw Gina Avery at the station, bringing her husband a lunch he'd forgotten at home or just dropping in to say hello, Ruth felt her insides tighten with shame. Gina was always friendly, often inviting new employees to family barbecues, and her genuine kindness made the situation even more unbearable. That morning, Ruth came to work earlier than usual. She sat in her empty office, looking out at the falling snow, and thought about how messed up everything was. Their affair with Forrest had been going on for 4 months now. What had started as a fling had turned into a deep feeling that only made it hurt more. Steve Boyd showed up at the station after her, which was unusual. He usually arrived at 9 o'clock. Lately, Ruth had noticed that he was often in the neighborhood when she was working late, and several times she'd seen his car parked near her house. It was disturbing, but she put it down to paranoia, a consequence of the constant tension of having to hide her relationship with Forrest. Steve looked a little twitchy. He walked past her desk several times, clearly wanting to say something, but never did. During the lunch break, he finally approached her in the break room. "Are you all right, Ruth? You seem tired lately." There was genuine concern in his voice, but there was something else in it that made her wary. "I'm fine, just a lot of work." She tried to smile as naturally as possible. "You know, if you need to talk about anything, I'm always willing to listen." Steve spoke slowly, choosing his words carefully, and his gaze was overly attentive. After this conversation, Ruth's anxiety only increased. She began to notice that Steve was recording every conversation she had with Forrest, every time they were alone together. There was a kind of unhealthy insistence in his behavior. That evening, she met Forrest at their usual place, a small motel on the outskirts of town. Room number 23 had become their refuge from reality, but tonight, even here, Ruth couldn't relax. "We need to stop this." The words she'd rehearsed all day came unexpectedly easily. Forrest, unbuttoning his coat, froze. "What's wrong?" "It's all wrong. Your family, your job, and Steve seems to suspect something." She spoke quickly, afraid to change her mind. "Steve? What does Steve have to do with this?" Forrest's voice became tense. Ruth recounted her colleague's strange behavior, her suspicions. Forrest listened in silence, his face growing increasingly somber. "I'll deal with Steve," he finally said. "And as for us, Ruth, I can't stop it. I can't stop thinking about you, wanting to be with you." He reached for her, but she pulled back. "We have to, for your family's sake, for my career, for yours. This can't go on forever." She didn't stay that night. Back home, Ruth pulled out her diary, an old-fashioned leather-bound notebook. She had kept it from the first day of her relationship with Forrest, writing down her thoughts, her fears, her hopes. Now those pages seemed like evidence of a crime. The next few days turned into torture. At work, he and Forrest talked only business, avoiding being alone together. He tried to talk to her several times, but she found excuses to avoid the conversation. Steve, meanwhile, had become even stranger. One day, Ruth caught him at his desk, supposedly looking for a report. His embarrassment seemed excessive to her. Another time, she noticed him taking pictures on his phone as he and Forrest discussed the details of the investigation in the archives. In the evenings, when she was alone, Ruth continued to write in her journal. It became a kind of therapy for her. She described her attempts to cope with her feelings for Forrest, Steve's strange behavior, and her growing anxiety that their secret might be revealed. When she arrived at work one morning, she found an envelope on her desk. Inside was a photograph of her and Forrest outside a motel. The photo was fuzzy, taken from a distance, but they were recognizable. There was no note, but Ruth knew exactly who it was from. That same day, she wrote a report for transfer to another precinct. It wasn't an easy decision, but she knew it was the only way to break the cycle. On her way home, she lingered at Forrest's desk, but she was never able to tell him of her decision. At home, she sat over her journal for a long time, rereading the entries of the last few months. They contained everything: her struggle with herself, her fear of exposure, her tormented love for a married man, her suspicions about Steve. It was a story that couldn't end well. The end of February was unusually chilly. Wet snow mixed with rain turned the streets of Oak Haven into an unpleasant mess. Forrest Avery sat in his office, looking through the blinds into the parking lot of the police station. He watched Ruth walk briskly to her car without lifting her head, without even turning toward his window as she had done before. The last 2 weeks had been a nightmare for him. Since that conversation at the motel, Ruth had studiously avoided any informal contact. She'd been impeccably professional in meetings, and she'd responded matter-of-factly when he'd asked her about her work. But it was as if a wall of ice had grown between them. At home, too, things were going wrong. Gina started asking questions about his late returns, about the strange phone calls when he went into the other room to answer. He tried to smooth things over. He bought her expensive earrings for her birthday, suggested a weekend trip to the seaside, but he felt his wife suspected something. One morning, while reviewing reports, he noticed Ruth pulling out a small book in a dark leather cover from her purse. She quickly wrote something down and tucked the book back away. The gesture seemed familiar to him. He had seen this notebook before in her apartment, but had never paid much attention to it. That same day, he overheard Ruth talking to Steve Boyd. They were standing at a coffee machine, and Steve was saying something about making the right decision and The need to be honest. Ruth looked alarmed and quickly walked away when she noticed Forrest approaching. When he returned home that evening, he found an envelope of photographs on the kitchen table. They showed him and Ruth entering the motel. The pictures were fuzzy, but recognizable. There was no note. Gina was upstairs, and he'd managed to tuck the envelope in his pocket before she showed up. His hands trembled. He spent the next few days as if in a fog. Every phone call made him flinch. He began to notice the slanted glances of his coworkers, though perhaps it was paranoia. But what bothered him most was that notebook of Ruth's. A week later, he learned of her transfer report. The news shocked him. He hadn't expected her to take such a step. That same day, he tried to talk to her, but she said it was already decided. Sleepless nights, tossing and turning in bed beside the sleeping Gina, he remembered every moment he had seen Ruth with that notebook. She often wrote in it after their meetings, sometimes took it out on her lunch break. He'd even joked about it once, calling it an expensive diary, but she'd only waved it away. Diary. That word was keeping him in suspense now. What did she write in there? How detailed had she been about their relationship? Did she mention their meeting places, dates, details of conversations? If that diary fell into the wrong hands, Steve Boyd, for example, or, God forbid, Gina, his life would be ruined. Back at the station, he began to watch Ruth's every move. He noticed that she always carried her bag with her, even when she went to the break room. The diary was obviously in there. Several times he tried to discreetly follow her after work, but she drove straight home each time. One evening he drove to her house. He parked a few blocks away and sat in the car for a long time, looking out the lighted windows of her apartment. He could see her silhouette. She walked across the room, then sat down at her desk. Probably writing in her journal again, he thought, feeling the anxiety building inside. Steve Boyd kept him uneasy too. His meaningful glances, his constant presence with Ruth, his occasional hints in conversation, all added up to a frightening picture. Forrest was sure it was Boyd who had sent those pictures. To top it all off, Gina had taken an unusual interest in his work. She asked several times about Ruth, about her transfer, about why such a promising detective had suddenly decided to leave. Each conversation was like walking through a minefield. The denouement was coming. He could feel it with every fiber of his being. Ruth was avoiding him. Steve was watching him. Gina was asking questions. And somewhere there was a diary full of dangerous confessions. He knew he had to do something, but he didn't know what. Nights he lay awake, running through possible scenarios in his head. What if Ruth decided to tell Gina? What if Steve already had the diary? What if the police department found out about their liaison? 20 years of perfect service, reputation, career, family. It could all come crashing down at any moment. Every morning when he arrived at the station, the first thing he did was to look for Ruth. She was always sitting at her desk, absorbed in her work, as if nothing had ever happened between them. Only occasionally he would see her take the journal out of her bag, and his heart would skip a beat. On one of those days, he made a decision. He had to find a way to get his hands on that diary, destroy the only physical evidence of their connection. But how could he do it? Ruth was constantly watched by Steve. She never left her bag unattended, and her apartment was secure. Forrest began to formulate a plan. He knew Ruth's daily routine, knew when she was home, when she went grocery shopping, when she played sports. He knew the layout of the rooms in her apartment. And most importantly, he had the duplicate key she had once given him, just in case. It was an unexpectedly clear March morning. The sun was slowly rising over Oak Haven, coloring the sky a soft pink. At 7 hours and 15 minutes, the police dispatcher received a call from Mrs. Parker, Ruth Callinger's elderly neighbor. The excited woman reported that she had heard a strange noise coming from the detective's apartment during the night, and now noticed the front door ajar. Patrolman Mike Donahue was the first to arrive on the scene. He went up to the third floor of the old brick house where Ruth lived. The door was indeed ajar, and there were signs of forced entry on the floor. Following protocol, he called for backup and only then cautiously entered the apartment. What he saw inside made him immediately contact the detective on duty. The apartment had been turned upside down, the contents of drawers dumped on the floor, books thrown off shelves, furniture overturned. Broken glass crunched underfoot in the kitchen, all the cupboards were open, their contents strewn about. Ruth lay in the living room by the window. She was wearing her home clothes, gray sweatpants and a white t-shirt, now stained with blood. Investigators would later determine the time of death, between 23 hours and midnight. The cause of death was a blow to the head with a heavy object, a bronze statue she was holding on a bookshelf. By 8 o'clock, an investigative team was already working at the scene. Technicians carefully photographed every detail, collected fingerprints, searched for fibers and other evidence. The medical examiner was examining the body, making preliminary findings. Forrest Avery arrived at the beginning of the 9th, just after he had been informed of what had happened. He stopped in the doorway, looking at the familiar room, now transformed into a crime scene. His gaze lingered on Ruth's body for a moment, and one of the officers noticed his hands trembling. The crime scene looked typical of a robbery gone wrong. The burglar probably didn't expect to catch the lady of the house. A struggle ensued, as evidenced by the overturned chair and broken vase. The perpetrator grabbed the first thing that came to hand, a statue, and struck Ruth on the head. Mrs. Parker said she heard some noise about 12:30 in the morning, but didn't think much of it. Ruth sometimes came home late from work. "She was such a sweet girl," the elderly woman lamented, "always saying hello, helping me with my bags from the store." The apartment was clearly looking for something. All the drawers were pulled out. Their contents were thoroughly searched. A laptop, a tablet, several pieces of jewelry were missing. But the safe in the bedroom remained untouched, although it was in a prominent place. This seemed odd to detectives arriving from a neighboring precinct. Steve Boyd showed up at the crime scene closer to lunchtime. He looked shaken, his usually neat shirt wrinkled, his eyes reddened. He stood in the hallway for a long time, watching the forensics team work, then quietly asked one of the officers, "Did she suffer long?" By the evening of the first day of the investigation, the picture of what had happened seemed clear enough. The perpetrator had entered the apartment around 11 p.m. by picking the lock. Ruth was probably in the bedroom, where they found an open book and unfinished tea. When she heard the noise, she went out into the living room and caught the burglar by surprise. The neighbors on the ground floor testified that they heard a noise like a heavy object falling, but they didn't pay much attention to it either. Strange noises were often heard in the old house. No one saw any suspicious people near the house at the time. Gina Avery arrived at the station as soon as she heard the news. She brought coffee and sandwiches for her husband and other officers working on the case. "It's terrible," she said, shaking her head. "So young, so promising." Forrest accepted the coffee in silence, avoiding looking his wife in the eye. The leather-bound notebook was missing from Ruth's personal effects, though her colleagues remembered that she had always carried it with her. It may have been one of the stolen valuables, investigators speculated. No one paid much attention to it, an ordinary notebook among other missing items. Forrest sat in his office for a long time that night, looking at the crime scene photos. Ruth looked so small and defenseless on the floor of his living room. He remembered how she liked to sit in the very chair that was now overturned, tucking her legs under her and sipping green tea. The investigation began following the standard pattern, interviewing neighbors, checking neighborhood surveillance cameras, searching pawn shops and the black market for stolen items. No one connected Detective Kalinger death with her work. Lately she had been doing only paperwork, preparing for a transfer to another precinct. Ruth's body was taken to the morgue around 6 in the evening. The car pulled slowly out of the yard, taking her to her final resting place. Mrs. Parker crossed herself, looking out the window. Steve Boyd smoked one cigarette after another as he stood by his car, and Forrest Avery sat in his office, methodically reviewing reports as if nothing had happened. The next day, all the Oak Haven newspapers ran headlines about the young detective's tragic death. Fatal robbery, tragedy in a quiet neighborhood, police search for the killer of their employee. Little did anyone know that the real story was just beginning. The county police department decided to bring in a detective from a neighboring precinct to investigate the murder of Ruth Kalinger. The choice fell on Stephen Tate, an experienced investigator with an impeccable reputation. In 23 years of service, he had solved many difficult cases, and colleagues respectfully called him Bulldog for his persistence in the search for the truth. Tate showed up at the Oak Haven precinct in the early morning hours, 3 days after the murder. Tall, thin, with attentive gray eyes and early gray on his temples, he gave the impression of a man from whom nothing could escape. The first thing he asked for was a private office and all the case files. Forrest Avery personally handed him the folders of documents and photographs. Their brief meeting was formal, a handshake, a few phrases of cooperation. Tate noted to himself that the captain looked too focused for a man who had lost a subordinate under such tragic circumstances. On the first day, Tate noticed a few oddities. First, the nature of the door break-in. The lock was damaged professionally, without unnecessary scratches, as if the perpetrator knew exactly how to proceed. Ordinary burglars rarely possess such skills. The second inconsistency was discovered during the examination of the crime scene. Although the apartment was turned upside down, giving the impression of a chaotic search, some of the drawers had clearly been gone through methodically. The items in them were not just discarded, but rearranged, as if they were looking for something specific. Tate spent several hours in Ruth's apartment, studying every detail. In the bedroom, a shelf of books caught his eye, all of them dumped on the floor except for a few forensic volumes that stood untouched. A casual burglar would not have made that distinction. The conversation with Mrs. Parker also brought interesting information. The older woman recalled that a week before the murder she had seen Ruth talking to some man outside the house. The conversation seemed tense, and Ruth was obviously nervous. Unfortunately, the neighbor couldn't describe the man because it was dark. Back at the station, Tate began interviewing Ruth's co-workers. Many spoke of her professionalism and mentioned her impending transfer. When he asked about the reasons for the transfer, no one could give a clear answer. Steve Boyd was visibly nervous during the conversation, avoiding eye contact and constantly fidgeting with a button on his shirt sleeve. Examining Ruth's work computer, Tate discovered that some files had been deleted the day before her death. The tech department was trying to recover them, but so far without success. There were gaps in her email as well. Several emails had been erased the same day. Tate paid particular attention to the missing items. The list seemed odd: a laptop, a tablet, some jewelry, and a notebook. The last item particularly interested the detective. Usually burglars don't take personal diaries, unless there was something important in them. By the end of the first week of the investigation, Tate had compiled a detailed report on the inconsistencies in the case. The robbery version was looking less and less convincing. He requested surveillance footage from neighboring streets, details of Ruth's phone calls over the past month, and information about her bank transactions. One fact particularly troubled the detective. Ruth had withdrawn a substantial amount of cash from her account shortly before her death. The bank confirmed that she seemed anxious and in a hurry. The money wasn't found in the apartment, but it wasn't on the list of stolen items either. On Friday, Tate decided to talk to Gina Avery. The captain's wife turned out to be a friendly woman, genuinely saddened by Ruth's death. She said she often saw her at the station when she brought her husband lunch. She seemed distant lately, Gina recalled, as if something was troubling her. That evening, Tate stayed late at the station, analyzing the information he had gathered. Suddenly, there was a knock at the door. It was Steve Boyd. He looked exhausted, as if he hadn't slept in several nights. "Detective Tate," he said quietly, "there's something I need to tell you, about Ruth, and about Captain Avery." Tate listened carefully to Boyd. What he had learned made him look at the whole case in a new way. Many of the oddities made sense now: the hasty transfer, the deleted files, the missing diary. What remained was to find proof. The next day, Tate began an unspoken check of Captain Avery's alibi for the night of the murder. Officially, he was at home with his wife, but the detective discovered that Gina had stayed late that night at the library for a book club meeting. This fact was not reflected in the initial reports. By the end of the second week of the investigation, Tate had accumulated an impressive folder of notes and evidence. Every detail, every inconsistency was adding up. The hard part was turning suspicions into hard evidence. Forrest Avery did not seem to notice the increased attention to his person. He continued to run the station as usual, holding meetings, signing documents. Only sometimes, when he thought no one was watching, his face took on a strange, tense expression. That evening, it was drizzling light rain. Steve Boyd was smoking nervously under the visor of Martha's Cafe, waiting for Detective Tate. He'd set up a meeting away from the precinct, on the other side of town, where no one could accidentally see them together. The soaked cigarette trembled in his fingers, leaving wet marks on the filter. Tate showed up exactly at the appointed time. He looked tired after a long day, but his eyes retained their usual sharpness of gaze. They took a table in the farthest corner of the cafe. An elderly waitress, knowing Boyd's regulars, silently brought 2 cups of strong black coffee. "I should have told you this earlier," Boyd began, tapping his fingers nervously on the table. His usually neat appearance had been replaced by a crumpled look, his tie askew, his shirt collar unbuttoned, dark circles under his eyes. He told how he had first noticed the strange behavior of the captain and Ruth about 6 months ago. At first, it had been little things, occasional glances, soft conversations that stopped as soon as someone came near. Then he began to notice that the two of them often lingered at the station together, ostensibly discussing business. "One time I saw them outside the Pine Grove Motel on the edge of town." Boyd spoke increasingly quietly, as if afraid they might be overheard. "It was an accident. I was coming back from fishing. They didn't notice me, but I sure saw them go inside together." Tate listened silently, making notes in a small notebook. His face remained impassive, only the wrinkle between his eyebrows growing deeper as he told the story. Boyd went on. He told how Ruth had begun to change, became nervous, absent-minded, often secluded for telephone conversations. And then suddenly she filed a transfer report. She didn't want to talk about the reasons, but I saw her crying in the archives when she thought no one could see. The diary story particularly excited Tate. Boyd detailed how Ruth always carried this notebook with her, how she carefully hid it from prying eyes. "One day I happened to see a few lines. She was writing something about impossible love and needing to stop everything." Boyd then described the captain's strange behavior in the final weeks before the murder, how he became increasingly irritable, how he sat in his office for long periods of time with the blinds closed, how he reacted violently to any mention of Ruth's transfer. "And then I started to notice he was following her." Boyd lit a new cigarette, though the previous one was still smoldering in the ashtray. "A few times I saw his car outside her house. He thought no one would notice, but I know his car a gray Ford with a distinctive dent in the rear fender." Boyd found the captain's demeanor on the day of the murder particularly suspicious. He was kind of jumpy all morning. Several times he tried to talk to Ruth, but she avoided him. And in the evening, although he usually went home no later than 7 o'clock, he stayed late at the station. By midnight, the cafe was empty. The waitress glanced meaningfully at the last customers several times, but did not dare to disturb them. Boyd kept talking as if a dam of silence had broken. He told of a telephone conversation with Ruth the day before her death. She sounded frightened, saying something about some pictures and how he wouldn't leave her alone. Boyd hadn't given it much thought at the time, but now her every word took on an ominous meaning. "And you know what the weirdest part is?" Boyd leaned closer to Tate. "The day after the murder, I saw the captain burning some papers in a dumpster behind the station. When I approached, he pretended he was just throwing away old reports, but I'd never seen him dispose of documents like that before." Tate asked a few clarifying questions about dates and times of events. His notebook gradually filled with names, facts, leads. The story Boyd had told fit perfectly into the picture he was beginning to put together. When they finally left the cafe, it was well past midnight. The rain had intensified, turning the streets into mirrors reflecting the neon signs. Boyd looked exhausted, but also relieved, as if he'd gotten rid of a heavy load. "Be careful," he said in parting. "The captain is not the man he seems to be, and I'm afraid he knows of my suspicions." Tate sat in his car for a long time, reviewing his notes. Boyd's story confirmed his own suspicions and added new details to the big picture. Now he needed proof, hard evidence that would stand up to scrutiny in a court of law. The diary had turned up in the most unexpected place. Tate was checking surveillance cameras around the Pine Grove Motel when he noticed one of them capturing a dumpster in the back of the property. Reviewing the footage from the night of the murder, he saw some person hurriedly discarding a package. It was hard to make out a face in the darkness, but the distinctive gait seemed familiar to the detective. The next morning, Tate personally surveyed the area around the motel. The container had already been emptied, but behind it was a narrow gap between the wall and the metal casing. It was there, wrapped in a plastic bag, that a notebook in a worn leather binding lay. The pages were slightly damp from the morning dew, but the text was clearly legible. Ruth's handwriting, neat with a slight slant to the right, filled page after page. Tate settled into his car and began to read. The first entries were innocuous, notes about work, thoughts about coworkers, plans for the future. But gradually the tone changed. There were mentions of Forrest, rare at first, then more frequent. Ruth described her feelings, her struggle with herself, her attempts to maintain a professional distance. He stayed late at the station again today. We sat up into the night discussing the robbery case. His hands accidentally touched mine as he handed over a file folder. I shouldn't think about it. He's married. He's my boss. It's not right. The entries became increasingly emotional. Ruth detailed their meetings at the motel, their conversations, their promises. She was tormented by guilt toward Gina, whom she truly respected. Several pages were marred with tear marks. Toward the end of the diary, there were disturbing notes. Ruth wrote of Forrest's strange behavior, his growing suspicion and jealousy. He is following me. Saw his car outside the house yesterday. When I asked about it, he denied everything. I no longer recognize the man I fell in love with. The last entry was dated the day of the murder. It ends today. I can't live like this anymore. I'll tell Gina the truth. She deserves to know. Forrest tried to talk me out of it, threatened me, but I made my decision. If anything happens to me, there's a flash drive with photos and correspondence in the top drawer of my desk. Steve was right. We need to stop this madness. Tate carefully packed the diary into an evidence bag. A lot of things were making sense now. He went back to the station and requested an itemization of Captain Avery's cell phone calls over the past month. The results confirmed his suspicions. Lots of calls to Ruth during the late hours, especially on days when Gina worked late at the library. The next step was to check the surveillance cameras in the neighborhood of Ruth's house. Footage from a nearby gas station clearly shows a gray Ford with a distinctive dent driving toward her house around the time of the murder. An hour later, the same car is traveling in the opposite direction. Another piece of evidence was found in Ruth's apartment. A duplicate key to the captain's office safe was hidden on the back of a picture frame. When Tate opened it, it revealed the very pictures Ruth had written about. Her and Forrest at the motel, in the park, in her car. Tech recovered the deleted files from Ruth's computer. Among them was a folder of correspondence. Hundreds of messages telling the story of their affair from its beginning to its tragic end. The last few emails were clearly threatening. The forensic report also worked against Forrest. The blow had been delivered with a strong hand, from the right, from top to bottom, exactly the way a man of his height and build would have struck. Microscopic traces of blood were found on the statue, not only from Ruth but also from the killer. He had cut himself on the sharp edge. By evening, Tate had enough evidence. He spread them out on the table in his makeshift office: the diary, the phone records, the surveillance photos, the expert reports. Every detail, every piece of evidence pointed to Forrest Avery. The final touch remained: a check of the captain's clothing. If he had indeed cut himself on the statue, there would be traces of blood on his shirt or jacket. Tate had sent a search request to Avery's house, emphasizing the need to check the trash cans. The experienced cop knew how to get rid of evidence. Now that all the details were coming together, Tate realized that tomorrow he would face the most difficult part of the investigation: the arrest of a respected police captain, a man everyone considered a model officer and a model family man. But the truth had to prevail. Ruth deserved justice. The morning was overcast. Heavy clouds hung over Oak Haven, promising rain. Forrest Avery arrived at work as usual at 7:30 sharp. He parked his gray Ford in the usual spot, nodded to the officer on duty, went up to his office. Everything was the same as always, except that in his jacket pocket was a plane ticket to Mexico. He planned to be away from this city in 12 hours. Stephen Tate was waiting for him in his office. 2 officers from Internal Affairs stood next to him. A familiar leather-bound journal lay on the desk. Forrest froze in the doorway for a moment, but quickly pulled himself together. "Good morning, Captain Avery." Tate's voice sounded calm and formal. "Have a seat, please. We need to talk about the night of March 23rd. Forrest slowly lowered himself into the chair. His face remained impassive, only the fingers clutching the armrests turned white with tension. "You were at Ruth Callinger's that night." It was not a question, but a statement. Tate opened the diary. "She was going to tell your wife about your liaison. You couldn't let that happen." A heavy silence hung in the study. It had begun to rain outside the window, the drops drumming on the glass, creating a bizarre accompaniment to this scene. "You've been following her for days, knew her routine. You had a key to her apartment." Tate laid out the facts one by one. "When she refused to change her mind, you realized you could lose everything. Your family, your career, your reputation." Forrest was silent. Drops of sweat protruded on his forehead, but he continued to maintain an outward calm. "We found your shirt, Captain. The same one you were wearing the night of the murder. You cut yourself on the statue when you struck the blow. The blood on the fabric is yours and Ruth's." Something broke in Forrest's face. He leaned back in his chair and looked Tate straight in the eye for the first time in ages. "You don't understand!" His voice sounded hoarse. "She was going to ruin everything. 20 years of perfect service, a happy marriage, the respect of her colleagues. It was all going to go to hell because of her stupid guilt." He spoke faster and faster as if a dam of silence had burst. "I loved her. I really did. But she didn't realize that sometimes you have to compromise. Gina would never have known. We could have been more careful. But Ruth got this idea of redemption into her head. The rain intensified, turning into a downpour. Rolls of thunder shook the precinct building. I didn't mean to kill her." Forrest ran his hand over his face. "Just wanted to get the diary and the pictures. Thought if I destroyed the evidence, she'd change her mind. But she heard me. Came out into the living room. Started yelling, threatening to go to Gina's right now." He was silent for a moment, gathering his thoughts. "The statuette just came to hand. One blow and it was over. I didn't even realize what had happened right away. And then I had to make it look like a robbery." Tate listened in silence. He'd seen a lot of killers in his career, but it was always hard to watch a respected man turn into a criminal. "You know what the worst part is?" Forrest chuckled bitterly. "When I got home, Gina was waiting for me with dinner, asked me how my day was, and I was sitting at the table eating her damn pie and thinking about the fact that an hour ago, I killed the woman I loved to save a marriage to a woman I hadn't loved in a long time." Another officer entered the office, holding an arrest warrant. Forrest looked at the document with a kind of detached interest. "Forrest Avery, you are under arrest on suspicion of the murder of Ruth Callinger." The official words echoed off the walls of the office. As he was led out through the common room, the entire precinct staff stared silently after their captain. Steve Boyd stood at his desk, clutching tightly the picture of Ruth from the last police picnic. It was still raining outside. Forrest stopped on the porch, lifting his face to the sky. Behind him, Gina, summoned to the station, was sobbing on her friend's shoulder. 20 years of marriage, 2 children, an impeccable reputation, all crumbled one March morning. A police car was taking the former captain to the detention center. Tate stood at the window of his makeshift office, staring out the window at the distant red lights. Ruth's diary lay on the desk, a mute witness to a love story that had become a tragedy. The story was over. Justice had been done, but the bitter taste of that victory would long haunt all involved. That night, all the Oak Haven newspapers ran sensational headlines. But behind the loud phrases about betrayal and retribution was a simple and eternal story of how love can turn into obsession, and the fear of loss can push a person to a terrible crime. A year after the tragic events in Oak Haven, much has changed. Forrest Avery was sentenced to 25 years in prison. At his trial, he kept his cool, pleaded guilty, and waived his right to appeal. Gina Avery sold their house and moved with the children to another state. They say she started writing a book, not about the murder, but about how to move on when the person you trusted implicitly turns out to be someone else entirely. Steve Boyd got a promotion and is now a detective. He still has Ruth's picture on his desk, a reminder that sometimes silence can cost someone their life. Ruth Callenger's diary is kept on file at the police department as physical evidence. Sometimes young detectives ask permission to review the case file. It has become a textbook example of how personal relationships can cloud the mind of even the most seasoned cop. Stephen Tate returned to his station. The case remained in his memory as a reminder that behind a respectable facade can hide a terrible truth, and justice sometimes brings not relief, but only bitterness. And in the small town of Oak Haven, life gradually returned to normal. Only sometimes, when people pass the old brick house where Ruth lived, do they involuntarily slow their steps and raise their eyes to the windows of her former apartment, remembering the story that changed their town forever.